Hello, my friends. If you're watching and listening to this video, I wish you a day full of energy and great health. Today, we have a special piece of news. Let's get started. Right now, there is a scramble in Kiev and across the European NATO sphere. Behind closed doors, there has been a flurry of activity and rising panic. Major revisions have been announced by the US, Ukraine, and European side to Donald Trump's vaunted 28-point peace plan. The Western mainstream media has been calling this plan a gift to Russia, a Kremlin wish list. I want to cut through that narrative and look at what's actually going on and what this really reveals about the balance of power, the battlefield, and the emerging multipolar order. First, about these rewrites. The truth is that no one outside a very small circle knows precisely what has been rewritten. There has been no clear public announcement spelling out which points have been changed. We've heard that Trump's people, with figures like Keith Kellogg involved, put together a draft. We've heard that Ukrainian officials, names like Yermak, are constantly floating around, and various European leaders have been pushing back and proposing changes. Zelensky himself has said that things are changing in the negotiations and that there are updates being made to the document. Some U.S. officials appear satisfied. Some Ukrainian reports say things are progressing. Others are more pessimistic, especially about the size of the future Ukrainian military and the question of withdrawing from Donbass. We know this much. Key contentious issues on the Ukrainian side include: 1, the size and structure of the Ukrainian military, and 2, any requirement for Kiev to withdraw from Donbass or accept a demilitarized zone that implicitly recognizes Russian gains. Those are sticking points. On the diplomatic track, Zelensky is heading to Washington, and selected European leaders, people like Meloni and Macron, are also due in D.C. to discuss these core issues and more. The idea seems to be to close out the Ukrainian-European edits and then bring something to Moscow. On the Russian side, we've had signals from figures like Ushakov, a close aide to Putin, that Moscow has received the plan, is reviewing it, and is prepared to negotiate on its basis. The tone coming from the Kremlin has been, we're ready to talk, there are points we agree on, and some we don't, and modifications will be needed, but we are working off this 28-point document. That, by itself, is very revealing. Russia's not saying, this is outrageous, we refuse to discuss it. Instead, they are calmly indicating that they are prepared to use it as one possible starting framework. Now, let's be clear. In my view, this isn't a real peace plan in the traditional sense. It looks more like a cocktail napkin brainstorming document that Trump circled threw together under time pressure because the front line is collapsing. It's reminiscent of Angela Merkel rushing to Moscow during the Debaltsevo cauldron in 2015, when Kyiv's troops were trapped and the Germans scrambled to get Minsk II signed to prevent total disaster. I see a similar dynamic here. Trump does not want a catastrophic collapse on his watch, so he has hurriedly pushed out a plan that is more about optics and timing than about a carefully engineered diplomatic settlement. That leads directly into Trump's style of deal-making. Trump is a master at driving the media cycle. He loves to seize the news agenda before holidays, before big political moments. So he blasts out a 28-point plan, leaks it to friendly outlets, lets others discover it, and suddenly everyone is reacting to his initiative. He puts himself in the pole position of the narrative. Here's my deal. Take it or leave it, decide by this deadline. That's classic Trump. The problem is that this style is fundamentally incompatible with serious international diplomacy. For a conflict of this scale and gravity, a genuine settlement would require months, even years, of quiet negotiations, multiple rounds of intensive talks, shuttling teams back and forth, and a summit only after a detailed text with contingencies and fallback positions had been hammered out behind closed doors. You would need technical annexes, verification mechanisms, phase timelines, clear security guarantees, and agreed procedures for handling violations. That's how serious statecraft works. Instead, Trump believes he can rewrite the book on diplomacy by scribbling some points on a metaphorical napkin, blasting it through his media ecosystem, and forcing everyone to react in public under artificial deadlines. Yes, that's brilliant for media control. He is very good at that, but it's a recipe for escalation, not stable peace. Once you float something like this into the public domain and slap a deadline on Ukraine, say the 27th of the month, around Thanksgiving, you trigger resistance, panic, and posturing that act by this date or else logic can easily work against you, especially if your stated goal is to wind the war down through negotiation. If Washington's real intention were to end the war, this approach is flawed. If the hidden intention is to drag things out, maintain the status quo, and preserve excuses for continued escalation and funding, then the plan and its inevitable failure provide exactly that. More crisis, more summits, more bases, more contracts. If Ukraine balks or if Europe pushes back, Trump can say, I offered a perfectly good deal, the greatest peace plan in history. They rejected it. I tried. And the war continues with Russia grinding forward and the West profiting and posturing. It's important to recognize one positive, at least on paper. Some of Russia's core strategic concerns, which were raised long before the conflict, for example, in Russia's December 2021 proposals to the U.S., have been acknowledged in this plan, at least superficially. There is talk of limits on Ukrainian armed forces, talk of neutrality, talk of restructuring NATO's relationship to Ukraine. That's not nothing. It suggests that parts of the U.S. establishment now understand that some of Russia's red lines are real and must be addressed. There is also a long-standing underlying instinct in both Washington and Moscow to avoid direct great power war. That impulse still exists. But the methods Trump is using generally don't work. We've seen a pattern of failure not only in Ukraine, but also in Iran, Gaza, and other theaters. The root causes: NATO expansion, security architecture in Europe, denazification and demilitarization in Ukraine, energy and economic architecture, the status of Crimea and Donbass cannot be resolved by a rushed marketing exercise. Now, let's drill into the leaked details of the plan itself and why it is, in many ways, a bad deal for Russia, despite Western claims that it's a gift to Putin. According to the leaks, the plan proposes allowing Ukraine an army of up to 600,000 troops, granting Ukraine fast-track entry into the European Union, keeping Ukraine formally out of NATO but giving it NATO-style Article 5 security guarantees, Article 5-like commitments, creating a demilitarized zone in Donbass and recognizing some territories as de facto Russian, but simultaneously locking 25% of Donetsk into a DMZ where Russia itself cannot legally deploy, using approximately $100 billion in seized Russian assets to rebuild Ukraine, with the U.S. taking 50% of the profits from reconstruction contracts, encouraging Europe to contribute an additional $100 billion of its own money, while the U.S. puts up no equivalent direct cash for reconstruction, opening the door for U.S.-Russian cooperation on Arctic and energy projects, with the U.S. positioning itself to profit from both sides, leaving key issues like the Orthodox Church, the status of the Russian language in Ukraine, and broader cultural guarantees to be governed by EU values and human rights standards, which have already been used to erode those things over the last decade. If you look at this carefully, it's clear the plan is not written by the Kremlin. It's written by people in Washington who want to lock in a neutral, in name only, Ukraine with a large army, deep integration into EU structures, including the future EU army, and Western security guarantees that amount to NATO in everything but name. It does not fully recognize Russia's territorial claims in Donetsk, one of Moscow's explicit goals. It keeps frozen Russian assets out of Russian hands and treats them as a slush fund for Western contractors and banks. It offers the U.S. profits on reconstruction and a privileged position in Arctic deals, while Russia is supposed to accept Western governance over orthodoxy and the Russian-speaking population inside Ukraine. Calling that Putin's wish list is propaganda. Is it also painful for Ukraine? In some ways, yes. Some points would be very difficult for Zelensky to sell to the hardcore nationalist and Bandera-influenced constituencies inside Ukraine. But overall, in its leaked form, the plan looks more like an attempt to freeze Russian gains, prevent a full Russian victory, and transform Ukraine into a heavily armed, EU-anchored, Western-controlled buffer state. So why is Russia even entertaining this? Because Russia holds the leverage and knows it. Moscow can afford to play along signal flexibility and let the West and Kiev twist in the wind while the battlefield continues to move in Russia's favor. That's what's driving all of this not think tank theories, but reality on the ground. On the front lines, there is a clear pattern of Ukrainian collapse in multiple sectors. Russian forces have been advancing in Zaporozhye, pushing into places like Guliapol and moving toward key nodes. They are grinding through the fortifications in Donbass. Once the Russian army takes the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, it's essentially a straight line to the Dnieper. The Dnieper River is the economic artery of Ukraine. If Russia secures the east and reaches the Dnieper, the economic viability of the remaining Ukrainian rump state plunges. That's why the Dnieper figures so prominently in Western discussions and in this plan. Some people in Washington understand that at all costs they must prevent Russia from reaching that river in strength. The panic you see, the rush for a freeze, is driven by this battlefield calculus. Western media obsesses over territory. Kilometers gained, towns captured, maps with red arrows. They downplay attrition, but the attrition numbers, especially Ukrainian casualties, are catastrophic. There are reports from body exchanges indicating ratios as bad as 40 Ukrainian soldiers for every one Russian in some cases. That kind of lopsided attrition, combined with steady Russian territorial gains, is politically devastating for the narrative that Russia is a paper tiger and Russia is losing man-meat waves. Yet that propaganda is still what many European parliaments are being fed by their own officers and experts. And if Trump genuinely wanted to end this war, he could blow up that propaganda pillar tomorrow by declassifying the real casualty numbers and forcing a new debate in Europe. Instead, his administration is trying to have it both ways: protect his image as the supreme deal maker, avoid an Afghanistan-style collapse, and keep the money flowing to defense contractors. Trump's fear of presiding over a collapse even worse than Kabul is palpable. Ukraine falling apart on television, entire fronts collapsing, mass surrenders, the Dnieper breached, would make Afghanistan look like a footnote. I suspect that fear is one of his primary motivations right now. Once he realized that the rosy Russia is collapsing briefings he was getting were false, after being told, for example, that some thin line of 60 Russian soldiers was supposedly all that held critical points like Kupiansk or Avdiivka, and then watching Russia systematically capture those places, he panicked. That's when he said to his people, put something together, talk to whoever you need to talk to, I'll sell it, I'll package it. I'll push it through my media and True Social, make it look like the greatest peace plan ever. From Trump's point of view, all scenarios give him some wiggle room. If Ukraine agrees to the plan, he can claim a historic diplomatic victory. If Russia accepts or negotiates modifications, he claims he ended the war on his terms. If either or both reject it, he blames them. I had a big, beautiful plan, 28 points, the best in history, and they refused. It's not my war. That's the key phrase. It's not my war. He's been saying that from the start. He insists that the conflict never would have happened if he had been president from 2020 onward, which is simply untrue. The structural drivers were in place long before, but as long as he keeps repeating that it's Biden's war, Obama's war, NATO's war, he avoids owning it in the way a serious statesman must. A real U.S. president functioning as a serious global actor doesn't talk in terms of my war versus Biden's war. He speaks as the President of the United States, with continuity across administrations. He accepts that his office inherits the consequences of predecessors' actions and that he must own, manage, and resolve the situation. Trump's refusal to do that undermines his credibility as a mediator, even if Russia is willing to humor him and let him play the role. Why is Russia willing to play along at all? Because they have priced Trump into the equation. They know they have to deal with this administration in Washington, and that at least with Trump, they have someone in the White House who can be spoken to directly and who is not entirely captured by the same crowd that surrounded Obama and Biden. They also know that in a few years, there will be another president, possibly a Democrat, possibly a different Republican like J.D. Vance, and that everything could be rolled back. So they're hedging. They are looking for diplomatic normalization, embassies, consulates, sanctions on diplomatic banking, the 25-mile travel limits on Russian diplomats in the U.S. as a precondition for serious negotiations. If the U.S. restored normal diplomatic relations and lifted some of the more absurd restrictions, that would send a powerful signal of good faith to Moscow. But so far, that foundational work is not happening. Instead, the focus is on the big splash of a peace plan. Europe and Kyiv also have their own reasons for resisting any final settlement right now. For European leaders, the war in Ukraine has become existential for their political legitimacy. The entire European project, Brussels authority, NATO's self-image, the story they tell their own citizens about democracy, rules-based order, and borders cannot be changed by force, hangs on the Ukraine narrative. If this ends with an acknowledged Russian victory, or even a perception that Russia got the better of the West, then Europeans will ask, what was this all for? Why did you deindustrialize our economies, blow up our energy relationship with Russia, wreck German industry, push us into a debt spiral only to lose? The ratings of leaders like Scholz, Macron, and Starmer are already abysmal. They do not want the war to end in a way that forces them to confront domestic crises they have ignored. They don't want to explain why they insisted Russia's economy was collapsing when it wasn't, why they said Moscow was running out of missiles when it clearly isn't, why they told their publics Russia's army was falling apart while it advances and adapts. It is much easier to keep the war going and push everything off into the fog of long-term support and shared sacrifice. For Zelensky, the logic is even more brutal. His job, in practical terms, is to keep the money flowing. As long as Western funds and weapons continue to arrive, he can keep the oligarchs fed, the nationalist battalions loyal, and his inner circle afloat. If he fails at that, he is finished politically and likely physically. That's why he always pushes for more weapons, longer range missiles, more money, more sanctions, more security guarantees. Ending the war, especially in a way that's seen as a defeat, would expose the corruption, the scandals, and the ugly reality on the ground in Kyiv. All of this is happening within a much larger global realignment. The phone call between Trump and Xi Jinping is part of that context. Trump immediately jumped on his platform and said everything was great. They talked about farmers, Ukraine, Russia, China is strong, Xi is a great leader. Maybe he'll visit China in April, the usual salesman routine. But if you read the Chinese side's formal readout, you see something different. Carefully structured sections on Taiwan, implementation of previous summit commitments, the Ukraine crisis, and the broader global order. Beijing is watching how the U.S. tries to pivot away from Ukraine toward confrontation and containment in Asia. Inside the U.S., domestic politics are shaping foreign policy. The appetite for the Ukraine project is waning. The spectacle in the Middle East after October 7 has split public attention and exposed contradictions in the U.S. position. MAGA voters are divided over Ukraine and Israel, but on China they are remarkably unified. Large majorities view China as a major threat and fear a Chinese-led global order if U.S. influence recedes. That China threat mentality pushes Trump toward more confrontational rhetoric and policy in the Pacific. At the same time, the U.S. economy is deeply intertwined with China's. You cannot simply cut China out of the global economy without inflicting enormous damage on the U.S. itself. Yet there are voices in Washington calling for exactly that. Strategically, the U.S. is encircling both Russia and China. It is building new bases in Scandinavia, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, to project power into the Arctic and confront Russia on its northern flank. The opening of the Northern Sea route between Europe and Asia creates new trade realities, and the U.S. wants to control or at least strongly influence that route. That has implications for Russia, China, and even for Israel's dreams of being a global trade hub via the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea. The U.S. is also positioning nuclear and conventional assets around the Pacific Rim while refusing to reduce its footprint in Europe. This is not the behavior of a country planning to de-escalate globally. It is the behavior of a power trying to freeze losses in one theater so it can focus more aggressively on others, China, the Arctic, global sea lanes. Overlay all of that with the rise of BRICS, the growing economic and political weight of China, Russia's resilience despite sanctions, and you get a picture of an emerging multipolar world. But this transition will not be smooth. There is too much money, too much ego, too much institutional inertia involved, from the City of London and Wall Street to NATO bureaucracies and think tanks that have thrived on confrontation for decades. Many people in Washington, London, and Brussels are still mentally living in 1945, believing they sit atop a hierarchy that no longer exists. They cannot accept Russia as a permanent, resilient power with huge energy, resource, and military leverage, nor can they accept China as an equal or superior economic and naval power. So, what does the Trump 28-point plan really represent in this bigger picture? In my assessment, it is not a genuine attempt to wash hands of Ukraine and walk away. It is an attempt to put a pin in the conflict, to freeze it on terms that prevent a clear Russian victory, buy time for the U.S. to reorient and preserve Western narratives. The deep state wants a pause, not a surrender. They want to stabilize the front so they can focus on China and other theaters without risking a humiliating televised collapse in Ukraine. Russia, with its superior view of the whole field, understands this. Moscow's leaders can see the entire chessboard in a way outside commentators cannot. They know that accepting a bad deal now could create horrible problems later, but they also know that outright rejecting Trump's initiative will unleash another wave of escalation talk. Long-range strikes deep into Russia using ATACMs, Tauras, or equivalent systems, new rounds of 500% sanctions, more attempts to strip Russia of assets and access. So they are biding their time, playing for diplomatic and battlefield advantage simultaneously. From here, there are a few key questions. Will Europe break with Washington on any essential point? Unlikely in the short term. NATO and the EU have largely fused into a single security political bloc in which individual states have very limited foreign policy autonomy. Will Kyiv ever accept the loss of Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson as Russian territory? European leaders keep insisting never, but that is their weakest legal and moral position. Crimea, especially, is a textbook case of self-determination under the UN Charter. If they cling to never, the whole plan collapses on this rock. Will the U.S. renormalize diplomatic relations with Russia, lifting absurd constraints on embassies and consulates, and allow serious negotiations to happen? That would be a real signal of seriousness. Will Trump, or any U.S. president, be willing to stand up and acknowledge U.S. and NATO responsibility for provoking and prolonging this war, and then own the solution as the president, not as the anti-Biden? I'm not optimistic in the short term. I do sense, however, that the narrative is changing under the surface. The battlefield realities are slowly breaking through the propaganda shell. The economic costs to Europe are becoming harder to hide. Public assumptions about who is winning and who is losing are shifting. Ukraine may yet prove to be the bucket of cold water that jolts the West out of its fantasies, but the process will be messy, bumpy, and dangerous. In the meantime, the 28-point plan functions as a kind of Rorschach test. Each side sees in it what they want to see. Western media tries to paint it as a giveaway to Moscow to rally opposition and extract concessions from Trump. Some in the American establishment see it as a way to freeze the war and avoid disaster. Russia sees it as a weak, amateurish document that nonetheless can be used as one more lever in a bigger struggle. My view is straightforward. The plan, as leaked, is a bad deal for Russia, a mixed bag for Ukraine, and a face-saving device for Washington. It is built on shaky assumptions and ignores fundamental issues like denazification, deep security guarantees, and the realities of a multipolar world. Whether it survives or collapses before Christmas is less important than the deeper forces it reveals, a declining unipolar order trying desperately to postpone the inevitable, and a rising set of powers quietly preparing for a world in which Washington no longer writes all the rules.